maybe Norman.
Thank you, Dennis. Ray, I wonder if you could pick up on that. As President CEO of Moody's, you not only have great information about corporations, but you also, of course, are engaged in ratings of countries as well as companies. And I wonder whether you share Dennis's optimism about the region, whether there are trouble points that you ought to be focusing on, or areas that perhaps have a level of concern that might be a little different from the overall perspective.
Sure. And first of all, I want to say how honored Moody's is to be here and to be participating, and we are very appreciative of the opportunity. In terms of Dennis's comments and Moody's views about the region, I think they are consistent, broadly speaking. The region has had a good growth track record. There has been significant achievement across many countries. We have, in terms of speaking about creditworthiness and our views of creditworthiness, the economies in the region are stable. They have been resilient, and that is certainly a positive as we move into what will probably be a more difficult macroeconomic environment driven by eventual monetary tightening in the U.S. And the consequences for different countries around the world as a result of monetary tightening. To that end, I would just point out that the discussions about quantitative easing and the taper or reduction in quantitative easing have certainly already been revealed in the market reactions. There has been some market volatility, currency devaluations, interest rate movements. So the effect or effects of tapering, when it does eventually come, have already been anticipated by the markets, and that's not surprising. I would point out that when the taper does begin, that is not in and of itself monetary tightening. That is just a reduction in the degree of accommodation that we have through purchase of Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities in the U.S. And I think it will be probably not until the end of 2014, perhaps even into 2015, before we see the quantitative easing has stopped completely, and we move into a period in the coming years of higher official interest rates and more monetary, actual monetary tightening. Now, the consequences for that are not domestic to the U.S. They do have implications for the rest of the world and the APEC countries. But we are looking at a situation where the consequences should be quite different as we move from country to country, depending on countries that have fixed interest rate versus floating interest rate regimes, whether there is borrowing in domestic currency or in foreign currency, the degree to which economies are driven by exports, and the degree to which a strengthened dollar and hopefully economic momentum in the United States encourages more imports and supports export economies. So there's a significant degree of variation that we would anticipate seeing in the coming years. And the Asian region is, certainly coming to this period of perhaps more difficult economic conditions from a position of strength. As I said, there has been stability in the region. There has been good growth in the region. There has been accumulation of reserves, and all of those speak very well for the ability of the Asian region to continue to grow through a different set of conditions than we have experienced in the last couple of years. So,
thank you very much, Ray. No conference on APEC could really begin to take off without some serious discussion about China, and we're honored to have with us Frank Ning, the chairman of COFCO, a major player in terms of consumer products, but also broadly involved in areas of importance to the Chinese economy. Frank, could you talk a bit about what we see going on with the economy now, and specifically what the implications of a new president this year might have for the economy going forward?
Thank you, Norman. First of all, it's nice to hear what a PwC report said about China. So China is still one of the most popular destination to travel and to invest. And also, Prime Minister Li also mentioned China with some confidence. Every time when the world economy kind of getting some challenge, people worry about China first, whether China's high growth will be slowing down. Since the very kind of first financial crisis in Asia in 1998, 10 years later in the US start to 2008, all these financial crises, then people worry about it, how China's economy will respond to that crisis and slow down and drag the world economy even further into a recession. But all the worries, concerns in the past today proved wrong. Why? Because the momentum of the economy or the growth are in a different kind of driving pace and structure. So it is an economy with 1.3 billion people, with 800 million people urbanization, with a reform in every aspect of the economy, and with the foreign investment coming to the country, over $100 billion a year, and with ability to export, and with ability to absorb, ready to serve, kind of ready to use technology from all over the world. And also with a relatively stable and more kind of economical, mature government. So put it all together, so the whole thing drive the economy grow for the last 20 years or more. But today, China again faces its own challenge. So like everybody said before, you can't rely on export anymore or too much. You can't rely on government investment too much. You can't rely on low-cost labor too much. You can't rely on these environmental kind of pollution things. Not being taken care of too much. Or you can't rely on all this currency depreciation. Actually, the currency has been appreciated for the last 5 years or 10 years even. So put all together, there's a new challenge. So will the economy slow down? A little bit. To which level? I think to a level the Chinese economy will feel comfortable to get a relatively reasonable full employment. So every year there's going to be at least 10 million, about 10 to 15 million people move from the countryside into the city to find a job. Every year there are going to be over 10 million college graduates to find a job. So at least the economy must grow at a level to be able to absorb this kind of labor forces. Otherwise, we are facing a stability issue. We are facing a lot of social problems. So how can China achieve this? I think reform. Our president will be here tomorrow to talk about in more kind of official way. But reform and transform its economy from investment type, from a low-cost type, to a more technology type, to a more domestic consumption type economy. And also the whole reform about the whole state-owned companies will happen again. So put all these possible reforms together, and also I think there will be still some government investment, government spending, investment, foreign investment, domestic investment, to maintain a level of growth and give lead time for the economy to gradually transform itself into a more sustainable and also consumption or related economy. So I think I'm still very confident from our business point of view, from COFCO point of view. We feel the consumption is still strong. We feel people move their diet from rice to milk, to pork, to beef. All these things drive the economy still grow. And also China will need a supply on all these very fundamental, basic consumption goods, so which will again drive the growth of the economy. Basically, I'm very optimistic, and also I think you will see the reform coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Mr. Prime Minister, I wonder if we could expand the conversation a bit to talk about geopolitical risk. Globally, of course, Egypt, Syria, Iran are places where there have either been changes in government or turmoil that has certainly gotten the world's attention. Within the ASEAN region, even in a week where Moody's gave the Philippines an investment grade rating, martial law had to be declared in Zamboanga to deal with tensions involving the MILF and MNLF. The Korean Peninsula has certainly had a level of tension this year, and for all of the good feelings toward China, Japan, Vietnam, the Philippines, to name 3 countries, have been involved in territorial disputes. With China, do any of these issues jump out at you and say, this is what we ought to be paying attention to in the year ahead, or are all of them, if you will, problems that you sort of have already taken into account when you think about economic opportunities over the next year or so?
I don't think we can easily identify one problem which is going to be the thing which will blow up. But I think we watch the overall trends, and as I said just now, all projections of economic progress, development, integration, and so on assume that there is stability, peace, and security. And if we don't have that, then all bets are off. And in the broadest sense, the stability, peace, and security in the Asia-Pacific depends on the key relationships between the superpowers and the big powers in the region. And the most important relationship is that between America and China. It has to be managed stably, responsibly on both sides with a long-term perspective. And America has to continue to be engaged in this region because it plays a very important role which no other country can replace. Not China, not Japan, not any other power. And that is something which we continue to encourage at every opportunity. I think the Americans have said that this administration has said that it intends to shift towards Asia-Pacific. They said pivot, but I think they've changed the term now. But basically to invest resources, attention, and presence in this region in order to develop the relationship. But America has many other preoccupations in the world. I mean, Syria, Iran, you are developing relations with the European countries. So for all the intention and the will, the circumstances don't always push in the same direction. And that is a practical problem. Within the region, what are the issues which need to be managed? You've listed some of them. I think the individual issues, they will be addressed one way or the other. I do not expect them to lead to war. You could have mishaps, you could have confrontations. It could happen at sea, whether over the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands, or in the South China Sea. It could happen on land, on the Korean Peninsula. But I don't think any of the countries want to go to war. All of them want to manage the relations predictably. Even North Korea, I don't think, wants to go to war. What needs to be managed, or what you need to watch, is whether, even as all the countries say that we need to manage this peacefully and with give and take, it is possible to work that out into a practical accommodation on the ground, which doesn't harden the confrontation and at the same time respects the political pressures in the respective countries. And all countries have got political pressures. Whether you're a democratic country with elections, whether you're a communist country with a different system, these are sentiments amongst the population that these are ours, this is sovereignty, this is sacred, this is not negotiable, not at any price. And when things are not at any price, it becomes very difficult to make a deal. So that's something which we are watching. The South China Sea is on the agenda between several ASEAN countries and China. ASEAN as a whole is wants to negotiate a code of conduct with China so that even though you can't solve the problems, you can manage them and keep them under control. But I think that's going to take some time. The other issues you mentioned, there are separatist problems in several of the countries. You talked about southern Philippines. Thailand, I think, has got an issue in the south. Other countries, too, have got various separatist movements. As long as there are local problems, each country can manage them. If the international terrorist groups take advantage of this local disorder in order to go and set up bases or training camps there, and then we have a problem. It has happened before. We have had the Al-Qaeda-linked groups operating in the southern Philippines and using the southern Philippines as training. We have Singaporeans who have gone there and been trained there and come back, and we've picked them up, fortunately, before they did any harm. But I think the terrorism issue is something which is a continuing low-grade illness which can flare up from time to time.
Thank you very much. Dennis, one of the things that interested me in all of the opening comments was that there was no particular reference to India. In years past at APEC meetings, questions would be raised about India versus China, who would grow fastest, who would show ability to sustain development. It seems as though that question is no longer front and center, and that if anything, questions about India's ability to maintain even the lower growth levels of the last couple of years is increasingly in question. Did your survey address India at all? And if not, from a PwC perspective, could you talk a bit about it? And Ray, I might ask you to follow up on that as well.
So a great point. I would say the survey did not specifically address India per se, but maybe just a comment or two. I think the one thing that the financial crisis has demonstrated to all is how interconnected all of these economies are around the world. And therefore, it's no longer, appropriate just to look at, what is happening in a particular country. The need is to look across multiple countries, economies, to really assess competitiveness, how one country competes in the global economy. And I think what you see happening in India today is as certain economies move forward because of whether it's good governance, policies, regulations, et cetera, other countries are potentially falling behind. And so when you look at the growth rates that we're seeing happening in India today versus what is projected in other parts of the world, other countries, the competitiveness of the Indian economy compared to other economies is slowing down. And we're seeing that certainly with the level of investment, foreign investment that's going into India today versus maybe what you would have seen 3 to 5 years ago. And I think that's an interesting way to think about where there are big opportunities today and what countries and economies need to do to really remain competitive on the global front. And I think you're seeing some of that affect the growth rates in India, at least in the foreseeable future.
Ray, I'd ask you to talk a bit about it, and then perhaps we could also pivot the conversation a bit to Latin America, which is obviously an important part of APEC as well, and get some of your thoughts regarding Brazil, Mexico, Chile, or other parts of the region. But first, from a Moody's perspective, how do you look at India these days?
Well, India recently has been, particularly hard hit in terms of the impact of market volatility on currency value. And that is, I'm looking at this from a credit perspective, that has implications to the extent in particular that entities borrow in foreign currencies. It makes their ability to repay more difficult and increases the likelihood of credit events. And that's, I would not at all single out India. It's an observation that would apply to multiple jurisdictions, but there has been a particularly acute reaction in terms of currency devaluation, rapid currency devaluation in India recently. The other comment I would make, and again, this would not point either primarily or exclusively to India, but generally speaking, growth policies are easier to pursue than reform policies. And to the extent that reforms are necessary, that is a more difficult, less popular, more difficult political challenge. And so necessary reforms that countries need to pursue are going to be challenged, particularly moving into a more difficult economic environment. So using periods of good growth to pursue needed reform is absolutely critical, and we don't want to lose those windows of opportunity. Turning to Latin America, again, we think that Latin America is, generally speaking, well positioned going into a more difficult macroeconomic environment that I think many would anticipate. Again, the growth that we have seen in recent years has been impressive.